Most sewing patterns and how-to tutorials are lying to you about the easiest way to sew curved hems. They're showing absolute beginners these complicated, advanced ways that you can sew a hem, but aren't very beginner friendly, which means that a lot of beginners get stuck on this step and don't actually finish their projects. And if you don't finish your project, you can't wear it. That's awful. That's like, what's the fun in that? And making something and not being able to wear it. So what if there was actually a beginner-friendly way to sew curved hems that were beautiful on the outside and on the inside? There is. It's called bias binding, and I'm going to show you how to do it in this video. Hi, my name's Abby, and I help absolute beginners get started sewing their own clothes. So if you have a brand new machine that you're not quite sure how to use yet, or you're struggling to use it a little bit, I've got a get started guide for you down below. But if you already know how to use your machine and you're trying to figure out that curved hem, let's talk about it. Now, what is bias binding? So first, I'm going to show you what bias binding isn't. We'll see that when I put this on the ruler and try to stretch it, this piece of fabric does not stretch at all. Okay? So what that means is that when I try to take this straight piece of fabric that's not stretchy and line it up against this curved line, we're going to get this little extra piece of fabric, this little pyramid shape or this little fold, and it doesn't look super nice, okay? Now, how do we get rid of this? What we do is we actually use something called bias binding, which is just a piece of fabric that has a little bit of stretch to it. Now, why does it have stretch? Because it's cut on the bias. And if you're not sure what bias is, check out this tutorial or this video, or you can grab my beginner's guide below that I mentioned before, and I have a lot of beginner sewing vocab in there for you. But basically, it means that we cut a piece of fabric at a 45-degree angle. And this will give us a little bit of stretch, not too much and not nothing, but a little bit. And this stretch is everything, okay? So we'll see that when I take this slightly stretchy bias binding and pin it along the curved edge, we don't get those little bumps or gaps or anything. It lays nice and flat. That's the magic of having this little bit of stretch, or the magic of the bias binding. Okay? So that makes sense why we're using this. We get that little bit of stretch and it makes us go along the curve nice and flat and beautiful. Okay? So when you go to buy bias binding, you can get two types. You can either get something that's called a single fold bias binding or a double fold bias binding. Now, a single fold is a piece of fabric that's laid flat, and the long edges of this rectangle are folded in towards the middle. Okay? So that's a single fold. Now, a double fold is the exact same thing, except we fold it in half. Okay? So if you have a single fold, you can make it a double fold yourself simply by ironing it in half. Okay? There's nothing too crazy different about the two, except that when you buy bias binding, double fold bias binding, they don't fold it exactly in half. So you will have one side that's a little bit longer than the other. Okay, you see that here? Perfect. Okay, this will come into play soon, so make sure to keep it in mind. Now that we know why we're using bias binding and what bias binding is, let's talk about how to apply it to your curved hem. So what we're going to do is take it and we're going to line up the edge of our single fold bias binding with the edge of the skirt. Now we want to make sure that we leave 3 to 5 centimeters of overhang like this, and then start pinning this all the way around. Okay, now if you have double fold bias binding, we want to find which side is the shorter side, and whichever side is shorter, we're going to take that side and pin it to the edge of our skirt or the curved hem of our project. And again, have that 3 to 5 centimeter overhang. Okay, then we're going to pin this all the way around exactly as if it was single fold bias tape. Okay. So once we've pinned that all the way around, we're going to sew it. Now, if you have double fold bias binding, try to sew in the crease that has already been ironed into your bias binding. Now, if you don't have a crease or you have a single fold bias tape, don't worry. All you need to do is sew around using a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so we're going to sew that all the way along the hem. Now that we've sewn the bias binding to the hem, we want to iron it down so it folds over itself. So basically we're creating a double fold bias binding. Okay, so we want to fold it down on top of itself and iron it all the way along this edge. Once we've ironed everything, we're going to take the whole project and flip it over. So far, we've been working on the right side of the skirt. Now we're going to be working on the wrong side. Working on the wrong side of the skirt or the project, we're going to fold this edge up until we can see just 1/8 of an inch or 2 mils of the skirt fabric on the wrong side. Okay, but if we can see the right side of the skirt on the back, then we know that the bias binding is hidden and we won't be able to see it from the front. Okay, so with just that little bit of the front showing, we're going to iron this all the way along again. And now we just need to tuck in these little tails at the end. And to do this, what we're going to do is come to one of the corners and we're going to take this tail and fold it back over itself and pull gently. And we want to pull until we get this to make like a 45-degree angle. And then tuck the tail down and fold the bias tape up again. And the reason that we do this is because if we've pulled the bias tape a little bit more, like a little bit snug, then when we look at it from the front, we can't see it. Now, alternatively, if you don't pull this tight, if you just fold it so it lines up with the edge of your skirt and then fold it up, you might be able to see it peeking around to the front. Now, if you pick a bias binding that in a color that matches your project, this isn't a problem. But sometimes you can't find the right color, and sometimes you want to add a cute detail to the inside. So if you want this hidden, make sure that you just tug it so that way it's tucked in nice and tight and we can't see it from the front. Once you've tugged that tail in nice and tight, we can trim this to be a little bit shorter and then fold the bottom edge up, flip everything in place, and make sure we can't see that bias binding from the front. Okay, do this on both sides, and then we're going to sew this. And we're going to sew it from the wrong side so we can keep an eye on that bias binding and make sure that we catch it the whole way around. And once we sew this all the way around, we just trim our threads and ta-da! Isn't that so much easier than other methods that you've been trying? This is a great method for finishing any kind of curve, and that can be a hem, that can be an armhole, that can be a neck hole. But again, the fabric must be not stretchy for this to work. Okay, if it's stretchy, there's a different technique for that. What if you don't have a wrap skirt, but you have one continuous circle all the way around? Then how do you finish these edges? Don't worry, I'm going to show you. So what we're going to do is start by pinning in the bias tape all the way along the bottom curved edge, same as before. And we are also going to keep this 3 to 5 centimeter tail at the very beginning. Okay, so we're going to pin this all the way around, and when we get back to the beginning, we're going to leave the length of our bias tape here again, so we have a tail. We need these 2 tails. Now, when we go to the sewing machine, we are going to start sewing 3 to 5 centimeters into the tape, so we keep that tail. This is very important. So we're going to start sewing, we'll sew all the way around, and when we get back to where we started sewing, we are going to take that tail and lay it down directly on top of itself. And then take the second tail and lay it on top of that. So we have 3 layers of bias tape all lined up nice and even. And then we're going to sew over this about 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch. Lock stitch, and when we remove this, we'll see that we have a nice clean loop all the way around, and then we can just trim off all of the extra tails. Then we will iron this down, just like we did for the other method. And then we will iron it up towards the wrong side of the skirt. And we see we have this really nice finished line that just creates a nice loop all the way around. The last step is to sew all the way around this. Now, I know that mine looks a little bit messy. I threw this together because I knew people would have this question, but I will try on future videos to make my samples a little bit tidier. How much bias tape do you need? Now, every project is going to be a little bit different. So the fastest, easiest way to figure this out is to just take your tape measure and measure around the hem. So just start at one side or at one point and work your way all the way around measuring. Okay? Once you have that number, add about 1/2 yard or 1/2 meter just to give yourself some wiggle room in case your measurement wasn't exactly right. Where do you get bias binding? So the truth is you can actually make your own bias binding. If you'd like to learn how to do that, check out this video. But in all reality, it's really easy just to buy this, and any fabric store or place that you buy fabric or thread, these kind of craft hobby stores, tend to have bias tape if you look for it. Now, if you really want some recommendations, I'll put some of my favorites linked below. But honestly, you can find this in a lot of different places, so don't worry, just keep an eye out for it. If you have any other questions about bias tape or bias binding, let me know in the comments below. If you're looking for a project to practice with this, check out the half circle wrap skirt. It's a beginner-friendly sewing project. It has no zipper and it has this curved hem, so you can practice this skill right now. And if you found this video helpful and you'd like to see more content like this, be sure to like and subscribe below. I am so excited to see what you make with this new sewing skill, and happy sewing!